Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Mysterious Galaxy virtual event. Tonight, I am joined by two wonderful authors. We are celebrating Maya Deane's release of Wrath Goddess Sings. Yay! Woo! Joining in conversation, we have Charlie Jane Anders. Hi, Charlie. Thank you for being here.
It's Charlie Jane, actually, but yeah, hi.
What did I say?
Oh, never mind. It's all good.
Okay. I don't know. Sometimes I could have said something weird.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Maya is a novelist, visual artist, and avid student of all the arts of civilization. She would also like to talk to you about, and by the way, your interests are so varied. I don't know how you keep up with all these. I'm going to just talk about some of them. History of forks, the history of beer, and how the only woman who became the king of Sumer was a bartender and brewer, cannabis, hotboxing, Amazons, and the archaeological record, and more. Very interesting stuff. Charlie Jane Anders is the author of City in the Middle of the Night, All the Birds in the Sky, and her most recent title, Dreams Bigger Than Heartbreak, the second book in her Unstoppable series. She's also won the Hugo, Nebula, Sturgeon, Lambda Literary, Crawford, and Locus Awards. Wow. It blows me away. But yes, like I said, tonight we are here to celebrate the release of Wrath Goddess Sing. For anyone out there who may not have purchased the book yet, you'll notice there's a link below that says buy Wrath Goddess Sing and get a signed book plate. Because guess what? If you buy it through Mysterious Galaxy, Maya's been wonderful and has sent us signed book plates, so we can make sure to get one of those for you when you order your book. And it looks like some of you have already found that Ask a Question button below. Congratulations. If you have any questions that you want to ask during the program, go ahead and submit them down there, and we will ask them later on. I think that's pretty much it for me, because I'm going to disappear in a second. But I did want to say, Maya, that cover and the title is just stunning. Like, how can not anyone be like, I better pick up this book and see what it's about?
It is so beautiful. No, Marcelo Boulevard did the cover. It is gorgeous. I'm a big fan of her art.
It's just such a great job. All right, everyone, I'm going to leave from here, but I'll see you all towards the end of the event. I'm going to leave it to these wonderful two ladies to take it away. I'll see y'all later.
Yay! So, my gosh, so excited to finally get to chat with you.
Me too. Oh my God.
I've been admiring your work for so long, and like I was so thrilled to be one of the first to read Wrath Goddess Sing. It's such an amazing book. I've just been like raving about it for months, and it's just I'm so glad it's finally here. It's so awesome. And yeah, so I read somewhere that you, when you were 7 years old, wrote your own kind of retelling of the Iliad, and I was wondering if we could start by kind of talking about that. And do you still have it? Do you still have your retelling from when you were 7?
I'm pretty sure I don't.
Salient points?
All right, so the main salient points. My dad had a Commodore 64. And when I was 6 years old, I was like, I want to be read adult literature, please. I'm not going to read if it has to be, Dr. Seuss. Please, let's start with something proper. And my father was like, the Iliad, which is a choice. I loved it. And then I thought to myself, wow, this is such a good story. I'd like to tell a story like this. So naturally, I tried to write my own, having discovered word processing on this Commodore 64. It was 6 whole pages long. I mean, it was probably like 3 whole pages, and I'm just misremembering. But I remember it being 6 whole pages long. And yeah, it was like a vague plot summary of the Iliad, hyper fixated on Athena and Achilles, and also Diomedes.
So even at that age, you were really interested in Achilles and Athena specifically, their dynamic and their whole like goddess patron, reluctant kind of badass kind of situation that they had going on.
Definitely. It's just a very strange, like, I don't know, there's so much going on there. And even then I felt like there was more than met the eye. But I wasn't sure what, because I was 7.
Right. I mean, it's such a weird, interesting story when you get into it. So I'm not going to hector you too much about your retelling of the Iliad, but okay, so I've definitely caught myself describing Wrath Goddess Sing as like a trans retelling or a trans reimagining of the Iliad, but it actually isn't, right? I feel like from talking to you, this is actually you just bringing out something that was already there, in the original text and just kind of bringing it to the surface. So could you talk about that a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, so like there's the thing that I can be pretty reliably counted on to just go on and on about is the lack of even with the Western canon, the idea that there's a canon is kind of an anachronistic and strange thing. Like, for instance, the Iliad is so famous because it survived, but in its own time, it was considered one of a whole cycle of Trojan War related epics that contradicted each other constantly, had totally different emphases. Like pretty much every element that you can think of was in some way complicated or contradicted by one or the other of these epics. And there's always been this thread of this gender variant, trans feminine Achilles. We see very early in the art. We see like Achilles is usually is represented as a man, but even very early is frequently represented as a woman. And in a lot of ways, what I was trying to do was kind of deconstruct the idea that there's like a single canon that all has to make sense, that sort of Edith Hamilton view of the Greek mythology, where everything has to be perfectly consistent with everything else, and there has to be a single thing that happened to each character, because that's just not how this works. It never has been. So there's this very long-standing thread of a trans feminine Achilles, which often people were grappling with in the strangest ways. Like the Romans found it kind of threatening. So we have the Statius version, the Achilles, which tries to make the most trans feminine episode in Achilles' life as sort of virile Roman male as possible by going with trans misogynist rape fantasies. Yeah, it's horrifying. I did not love it. But if the Romans can do that, I can do the opposite.
Sure. So is it the Romans' fault that we don't know about this now? Or is it like 19th century people who kind of fucked everything up? Or is it like some mixture of that?
I think it's a lot more recent. It's more the last couple hundred years. Like the idea that you need a single consistent version of the narrative, and the idea that that version of the narrative should be as edifying and pure as possible. Oh yes, as my friend Tessa Fisher pointed out in the chat, yeah. Achilles was said to have spent a number of years living as a woman on the island of Skyros, which is off eastern Greece, before the war. And you'll find some classical authors asking as though it were a riddle, what was Achilles' name among the women? Without, really pointing out that it was actually pretty well known that it was Pyrrha.
Right. So, I feel like the 19th century has a lot to answer for in terms of just like how we understand classical antiquity, but also a lot of other stuff. Like they were just the fucking Victorians, man. They kind of pooped all over everything, I feel like.
Oh yeah, no, it blew my mind to realize that like there were all these avid Victorian collectors of like ancient statuary who were like actively collecting like nude statues of trans women from the classical period and then putting them way out of sight and being like, never speak of these, but they're really old and we don't want to destroy them.
Oh my God. Yeah, one thing I love about this book is that Achilles isn't the only trans character. There are other trans characters. There's the Kalai. There's like, a trans mask character. And like, why was it important to like populate the world with like lots of trans people who had different perspectives on being trans?
Well, a huge part of it is just that's something that interests me enormously. The fact that so much of our diversity, so much of what makes us interesting only really comes out when we're actually able to interrelate with each other. In a context where you're the only trans person in a sea of cis people, you'll always be defined by that. And a lot of the individual particularities won't really have a lot of room to breathe. So I was really interested in seeing a lot of trans characters with different ways of relating to being trans, with different ways of relating to each other, with different ideas about what they owe each other, and exploring some of the conflict there too. Because, well, as much as I think we tend to be very generous with each other and give a lot of love, there's also a lot of conflict in our community just because hurt people under stress.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that kind of bugs me about the trans community as a trans person who's been in it for like, you know, a long ass time is stuff like trans medicalism and kind of like the way that like trans people look down on each other based on like how much access to like resources and medical interventions and other stuff that we may or may not have had in our transition. And I feel like part of what I loved about this book is that you kind of find a way to address that because of Achilles' connection with Athena, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but this kind of happens early in the book and is mentioned in the jacket copy, I think. Because of Achilles' connection with Athena, Achilles gets to kind of have a very easy ride as a trans person in some ways, gets to have just like the full package kind of, without going into too much detail. And then there are other trans people in the book, like the Kalai, like, you know, some other trans people that we meet who didn't get that. And Achilles, and, you know, Achilles has a servant who's trans who didn't get to have all the like bells and whistles that Achilles just had handed to her. And so like, you know, were you trying to kind of talk about real issues in the trans community with that sort of thing, like privilege and like, you know, class and everything else?
Privilege, class, resentment, the realization that like, I mean, obviously we should all have access to everything we need. Abundance should be the goal, right? And the ways in which that the lack of that access, the lack of that equity of access separates us from each other. I mean, one of the things that torments Achilles is that although she has this access, that kind of cuts her off from the only people that she really feels can fully understand her. And it cuts her off in multiple ways. Obviously, there's some resentment, as in the case of a character I won't spoil. But also, there's enormous guilt. And there's resentment that she can't give them what she has. And her frustration, like it's very easy to respond with anger when you can't exist in a world of equity. So I was interested in exploring that.
But I mean, Achilles also kind of part of what makes her so relatable is that she is a little unconscious of her privilege, and she's a little bit arrogant. She kind of takes for granted how lucky she's been in some ways. And it's complicated. She kind of looks down on some of these other trans people around her.
One of the things I enjoy with Achilles is the opportunity to catch a character in those last moments of unconsciousness and those first moments of consciousness. That sort of moment where you're like, how dare you make me think about this? I hate you. But you have a point.
Yeah,
there's something just very disarming about that to me, because Achilles can be extraordinarily selfish. And yet, I feel like in a lot of ways, that's such a human thing, right?
For sure. So back to how the Romans and, you know, the Victorians ruined classical antiquity for us with their arrogant bullshit. You know, one thing I've been obsessed with for a really long time is this notion that like classical Greek culture just kind of sprung up fully formed, like, you know, an egg from the brow of Zeus or something. I don't know. That's a weird metaphor, but, you know, Zeus just pooped it out one day, I guess. Anyway, but, you know, the idea that the Greeks didn't learn anything from Egypt and from North Africa and Phoenicia and like all these like, you know, North African, Middle Eastern cultures didn't contribute stuff that the Greeks kind of benefited from. And I'm wondering, why was it really important to you to show Egyptian characters, like especially, Mariapi? I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation of her name. But, there's a really amazing Egyptian character in the book. We go to Egypt. We kind of see that Egyptians have all this knowledge and understanding that the Greeks don't have. Why was it important to include that in the book and to kind of show that?
Well, part of it is just that during the Bronze Age, and indeed into the Hellenistic period, everyone, like the Greeks, pretty much universally were like, oh, actually, no, we owe the Egyptians and the Babylonians almost everything. And that really only changes after the Ptolemies colonize Egypt and after the Seleucids colonize most of Babylonia, at which point they start waxing poetic about the superiority of their culture. But because, of course, people invent self-serving narratives. But for 1,000 years before that, Egypt was the center of the world to them. Egypt was the superpower, and the Greek states were backwater states, relatively speaking, or at least peripheral. And everyone knew that. And part of it was just wanting some realism there, Like, we tend, because of the Victorians, thank you, Victorians, but also because of the Hellenistic states, we tend to have this imagination that Greek mythology takes place in, like, Hellenistic imaginary playground land. But it's actually set in the late Bronze Age. It's set in this very specific time and place, which was dominated by Egypt. Like, there were millions and millions and millions of people in New Kingdom Egypt when there were so many fewer people in Bronze Age Greece. It was literally a backwater by comparison. So, yeah, part of it was just wanting to take the setting seriously in ways that I think maybe if you're a politically motivated Victorian who wants neatly boxed civilizations, maybe you don't want to do.
Yeah, so, okay, I see the book Dreadnought by April Daniels behind you, I love that book. I'm a huge fan of it. I think I blurbed it. I can't remember. Anyway, I love that book. And one thing that Wrath Goddess Sing, and again, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but I feel like this is on the back cover, like the back jacket blurb description. One of the things that your book has in common with Dreadnought is that kind of the main character, in this case, Achilles, I don't know where I was going with that. In this case, Achilles gets to kind of have a magical transformation and kind of, it's kind of a wish fulfillment thing for trans women, I think, that you just get to like, woof, suddenly you've got like the body you wish you had. And it's, and I always feel like I've seen a lot of debate about that in the trans community as to whether we should tell those stories because, are we like downplaying how hard it actually is? Or are we like, I've been on panels where trans people argued that those kinds of stories are bad for various reasons, and I don't want to get into that. But part of what you and April both do is you have this like, oh, miraculous, wonderful transformation early on in the book. And then you start to see all the downsides. You start to see all the kind of negative aspects of that. And it's like the wish fulfillment followed by, oh, shit, there's a lot of stuff that I have to deal with now that's actually really tough, that comes as a result, as a price of that, I guess, or as a result of that. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that, like about that kind of like making that wish fulfillment kind of complicated and messy and kind of messed up.
So part of it was thinking about all of these issues from the perspective of someone who's had access. I wrote this book right after I was sufficiently recovered from bottom surgery to sort of go back to work and be able to think and be able to write, because it was like the concrete boots had come off. I had access to all these parts of my brain that had been frozen by not having what I needed. And my life became, in some ways, immeasurably easier. I had immeasurably more power to put into writing. And yet at the same time, that was, well, the several years since then have been intense. And one of the things that it was very clear to me is, yes, you can get what you individually need. But as they say, we live in a society.
I'm just
even
do
the
my
most fortunate individual, like we have this going on.
Yeah. So obviously I'm really into Amazons. You know, I'm wearing my Wonder Woman t-shirt. And like I know that you're now writing some stories about Amazons, is that right?
Yes.
And you know, can you talk to me about Amazons and like why you're interested in them? And it doesn't feel like they're very trans accepting in Wrath Goddess Sig. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
So one of the things that I played with the Amazons and the Achilles, which is like a sort of subtler world building element, is as the impression you might get from Greek mythology is that Bronze Age Greeks were maybe a lot more accepting of trans men than trans women, as evidenced by the fact that we have so many stories of trans masculine people just being casually accepted. And yet all of the stories of trans feminine characters, like for instance, Salmakis, are tormented and anguished. And that kind of stuck in the back of my brain and kind of bothered me in, I think, productive ways. So with the Amazons, I explored the inverse of that, which is one of the things that informs the relationship between Achilles and the transmasculine Amazon character, whose name I won't reveal because it's a big spoiler. And there, the Amazon culture is kind of the inverse. Had Achilles been born an Amazon, she wouldn't have been othered to begin with. That would have been not particularly, there would have been no legible otherness as far as the Amazons were concerned. They would have just been like, okay, we'll roll with that. Which lets me explore the ways that, you know, there are in many societies these very different roles. Like most societies that have relatively casual acceptance of transmasculine people traditionally have been pretty hard on trans women, and vice versa. And maybe I'm not going to speculate why, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore. With the Amazons, I don't know, there was a lot I wanted to consider because, well, to the ancient Greeks, the Amazons were a straightforward fact of history. It was actually pretty late in the game that revisionist Greek historians started asking, but were there really Amazons? Isn't it kind of ridiculous to think you would have these women cavalry riders founding terrifying but rather differently organized empires? But no, like, so modern archaeology has made it clear that, like, from the Middle Bronze Age, we have these steppe cultures which frequently feature somewhere between a third and half of their warrior burials being women. It's not a particularly great stretch to say Amazons from there. The dates line up. The material culture lines up with the legends about the Amazons, by which I mean we found their hot boxes and tattoo kits, which is pretty neat. There's actually this amazing classical era art, which is just like all these Greek women just sort of like staring as these Amazons show off their cool tattoos. They're just like, oh my God, what cool tattoos. And then you've got these Amazons just, you know, kind of like flexing. And I thought that was really neat. Fascinating.
That's awesome. I love it.
So I guess like why would I want to world build in a less interesting way than I think actually was?
But the Amazons they're not entirely sympathetic characters in your book. Like they're kind of, they're actually on the side of some not great people. I don't know.
Well, but that's the other thing, right? Just because someone is powerful and interesting doesn't mean they have to be sympathetic at all.
Points. I mean, there are parts in your book where I didn't feel like Achilles was entirely sympathetic, but I still rooted for her because I was like, she's just so badass and cool. And like, I don't know.
I kind of feel that way about Helen.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about Helen because I feel like you kind of like Helen really doesn't come across like she doesn't come over well at all in your book. She's powerful and like amazing, but and like the thing where like Achilles just his first encounter with Helen, I'm just not going to spoil it, is like breathtaking. It's such a cool sequence. It's such a cool moment. Like I was like, dang. But she's kind of a, she's got her own agenda. She's definitely like, I feel like there's an undercurrent in this book of like people who are kind of pro slaughter in a really gross way. And she's one of those people. Like she's one of those people who's like, yes, die for me, kind of.
Yeah, I think Helen kind of embodies the unapologetic. Like one of the things that fascinates me about the Bronze Age is the degree of honesty on the part of different elite classes about what they were.
Right.
Like not too long ago, I got to go to Luxor with a really good friend. And one of the things that really struck me just looking at these ancient 3,000-year-old monuments, I saw these two seated, enthroned figures of Amenhotep III, but like obviously Ramses II had carved his name on them. And there are these there's a line of like Canaanite kings being led away in neck shackles. There's a line of kings from Nubia being led away in neck shackles on the opposite throne. There's just this celebration of the cruelty of power as something beautiful. And it's a very alien view. It's not attractive, except it kind of is. And that is horrifying. Just the fact that unapologetic and cruel power can be like that is something that kind of got stuck in the back of my brain and I can't let go of, because even if they hire PR firms that can kind of polish up their reputation and be like, no, it's actually noblesse oblige, that underlying reality is there. And I'm fascinated by these Bronze Age elites who didn't particularly hide it, who didn't even think they had to, who were like, actually, I can crush you, and it's because I'm beautiful and better than you.
Yeah, and then there's the gods. By the way, please use the ask a question button, folks. We're going to probably open it up to questions in like 5 or 6 minutes. So we'd love to have lots of amazing questions in there. I already saw there's some really great ones already. Yeah, I mean, I kind of always knew that the Greek gods were like horrible monsters. Like I never thought, oh, they were awesome. But, I like the idea that in your book, they're basically kind of energy vampires. They're just kind of like, they're kind of like almost pathetic in a way. Like they're not even like, they're the most kind of pitiful part of the book in a weird way, which I loved that reinvention of them. And can you talk about like where that comes from and like why you decided to portray them that way?
Someone described them to me recently as being some combination of like ancient former child soldiers and war refugees perpetuating a cycle of violence. And there's some justice to that. I mean, I don't know. I thought about the histories of the gods that we are given in all of these Bronze Age mythologies. And if you take those seriously, and if you take seriously the idea that the gods have been around a while, and you don't put that in an unhistorical otherwhere, if you don't imagine that there were, 100,000 years of golden ages, but that this actually had to happen in historical time, the last 13,000 years or so have been pretty rough for humans. So
I mean, they've had good moments. They've had some good moments.
There were good moments. We've had some good moments, absolutely. But like, as far as we can tell, it starts with like, I don't know, some kind of meteor burst leading to a sudden ice age. Like the sort of movement from the Upper Paleolithic into the Neolithic was probably, there gradual, but if you're around for tens of thousands of years, also really traumatic. Yes, boo, younger Dryas, yeah. And yeah, like, so who would survive? Who would survive and take on the role that the gods played in those societies? Societies which invented warfare, human sacrifice. Like, we have all these early graves from like the very early Bronze Age where you've got these super powerful kings and slaughtered retainers. It's like, okay, what were their gods like? If these are the same gods, what kind of people would they actually be?
Yeah. I mean, gods do tend to be assholes. It's kind of part of the job almost. It's part of what we want them for. We want someone who can just be a total asshole and get away with it. And we can be like, yeah, I worship you because you're such an asshole and nobody can stop you. Yay.
Impunity.
So I guess, final question. One of the things I really loved about this book was just like the battle scenes were just so incredibly visceral, and all the little details, felt so just like vivid and well researched and well drawn, to the point where it really felt like you were in it, like you were in the kind of middle of the carnage, which it's just like I love a good fight scene or a good battle scene. And I feel like this had some of my favorite ones that I've read in years. Like, how did you research that? Did you practice sword fighting? Did you do a ton of research on like the archaeological evidence? I know you've got your amazing knife, which nobody's gotten stabbed yet. So
it's a Type G Mycenaean bronze short sword.
Right. So tell us about how you researched your battles. Sorry, it's not a knife. It's a short sword. I apologize.
Yes, Alina gave it to me as when I finished the book and sent it out into the world. She was like, "Good, we will reward you."
Nice.
So the military history of the Bronze Age is fascinating to me because like so many other things, it's been clouded by archaeologists who didn't think too much about the practicalities of combat. So, for instance, there's this entire strain of thought, which is finally on the way out, but which held that the Mycenaeans would have just used their chariots to get to the fighting and then hopped out and fought on foot, which is ridiculous. We have their accounting records from their palaces. They spent so much of their resources maintaining these massive chariot forces and these composite bows and all of that because they used standard ancient Near Eastern tactics, which is unsurprising because this was 50 years after the Battle of Kadesh, which was fought in Syria between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And a lot of Achaeans were probably there as mercenaries. So we know a lot about how it would actually have gone. The only accurate records are the text records. Yeah, basically. So we know a lot about how that kind of combat would have been staged, how it would have been fought. And a lot of it is just assuming that people were using logical tactics and that people in the past weren't idiots. And then trying to inhabit that. I think it's really easy to buy strange interpretations. You know the saying that archaeologists sometimes have that like, an archaeologist had no idea what something was for if an object is labeled a ritual object.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Right? It's like, actually, that was a fork. Okay. That was, those were tweezers. No, it was a ritual object. Tweezers, actually. Like,
I mean, for some of us, tweezers are a ritual object. I don't want to judge. I don't know.
Kat is right. The way chariots kick up dust is so cool. And that was part of my research. Like, I did go and try to get a feel for how chariot dust patterns look on different kinds of terrain. I guess because, yeah, I'm a nerd. So this is just something I can focus on understanding.
Cool. So we got a lot of questions in the chat. Alina wants to know, why is Achilles so into dolphins? And Kat adds, and horses. So dolphins and horses.
So Achilles is a horse girl, but that's not really surprising. One of the things Homer says over and over is Achilles is a horse girl. I mean, not in so many words, but like on and on, you know. Thea is in Thessaly. It's associated with horses from a really early age, a really early date. And constantly Achilles is associated with these horses. In fact, Achilles horses are so famous that they're canonically, like, we know their names. I just used the traditional names for Achilles horses. And there are legends about them. They're supposed to be immortal horses and all of that. They have stories that continue after the life of Achilles. So I thought to myself, okay, this is an opportunity for a major character relationship between Achilles and two characters. And I think restricting who gets to be a character to human characters and treating horses as like meat motorcycles is probably missing out on the opportunity to have some really interesting character relationships. Yeah, Homer spends so much of the poem talking about horses. So it makes sense to have Achilles be a horse girl. For dolphins, it's less that Achilles is a dolphin person, and more the dolphins are really interesting, and a certain other character is a dolphin person, and Achilles is like, okay, let's go with that. And dolphins are fascinating to me because they are so similar to humans in their vices. They do premeditated murder. They have politics. Obviously, they're well known for sexual assault. They're very scary beings. Yes, Tessa is correct. Greek equestrianism, granted from a millennium later, they cared a lot about the welfare of their horses, but definitely there was a high degree of taking care of horses that we know of from like Mitanni era horsemanship manuals. So from like the 1400s, so 200 years before this. And yeah, with dolphins, I was really interested in exploring how, if we could talk to dolphins, who are in so many ways our closest peers, we might find that we shouldn't romanticize them. And that communication is fraught, like communication always is. And yeah, Selena is correct. Most Egyptian chariot manuals use Hurrian, and well, yeah, which is funny because the Mitanni chariot manuals seem to have also preserved some older, like, Indo-European language. But Hurrian was the language of the Mitanni state with some specialist terminology from older Indo-European language.
Okay, so somebody, I can't see their name, wants to know, what themes did you explore in Wrath Goddess Sing that you plan to continue to explore in Beautiful on the Horizon?
I've been scooped. Beautiful on the Horizon. No, it's fine. Beautiful on the Horizon is, oh gosh, power, obviously, the nature of power. The ways in which, so Beautiful on the Horizon is the story of Kia, just for context. Which, if you want to know who Kia is, read Wrath Goddess Sing. Yeah, power, imperialism. One of, like, obviously I introduced themes of Egyptian imperialism in Wrath Goddess Sing. But we're very much on the periphery of that. Their influence is indirect, and their dazzle is relatively intact. And so what I'm working on now is kind of like peeling back the dazzle and seeing what's beneath. And also kind of doing trans girl Monte Cristo in Amarna era Egypt. Cool.
Nice. So Kat wants to know, what was the first scene you wrote for this story?
The conversation between Achilles and Aphrodite, which happens almost at the end of the story. That was the first thing I wrote. And then I was like, I need a plot to get here.
Okay, so Maddie, Jean Grey's lesbian clone, awesome name, wants to know, where does Athena being Achilles' mother come from?
Athena being Achilles' mother comes from my interest in exploring, like, as a trans woman, we tend to have multiple mothers. Like, some of the most important maternal relationships in our lives will be with people who are there for us, even if they're complicated characters in their own right, and even if they're not our birth mothers. And family among us works in that way too. So Achilles has another mother, but Athena is like her goddess mother, the mother of her soul or goddess half or whatever it is. And yet she's an incredibly fraught, complicated, and scary figure with massive problems of her own. And that's something I was really interested in thinking about. Why Athena in particular? Well, one of the first scenes in the Iliad features Achilles and Agamemnon kind of at the point where Achilles is like, now I'm going to kill Agamemnon in front of everybody, just at random because I'm mad, and is about to do it. But Athena's like, no, you're not. Invisibly grabs Achilles' hair and is like, no, do not do that. And then continues to do that sort of thing for the rest of the poem. Actually, one of the interesting elements in the Iliad is that Thetis repeatedly does things that will eventually get Achilles killed. And Athena repeatedly does things to reduce the odds of Achilles' death. So I was interested in exploring that. And also, when I was 7, I was obsessed with the connection between Athena and Achilles. And
as
it's my book.
Previously mentioned. Yeah, so Amanda wants to know, Amanda wants to know, how did you approach the relationships, romantic or otherwise, between women in this book?
Oh, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I love the relationship with Mariapi. That's like my favorite, and with Patroclus. Those three, like their kind of connection is just so great. I love it.
One of the things that I was really interested in exploring in this book is the way in which some of the most intense relationships, in some ways the most intense romantic relationships, are not necessarily the sexual ones. Some of the people you most care about, where you'll sort of like slow motion run across the beach when you see them and just, are not necessarily people you're sexual partners with or ever would be. And I think it's really important to explore that and to not necessarily need the sexual relationships to carry that emotional weight, because they don't necessarily have to. That said, another thing I was just really interested in exploring was agency. Like all of these women are very big personalities with a lot of power. Frequently because they have the social power to be allowed to have big personalities. And I think it's interesting to kind of explore, I don't know, what people should all be allowed by looking at the ones who are allowed to have it.
Okay, so Candace asks, what are some of your favorite trans novels? And I feel like We can look at the shelves behind you and maybe get some hints there.
Big fan of this.
Oh my God, I love that book. It's so great. I'm just obsessed.
Light from Uncommon Stars is absolutely beautiful. And it's, technically speaking, it's one of the most musical things. Like, just on a structural level, it's divided into bars. Like, these little scenes are like little measures in the book. And it kind of unfolds or unspools that way in this really interesting way. Behind it, we see KK, which I really like, but not a trans novel. I feel like Dreadnought requires no explanation.
It's so good. I love it so much. Dreadnought, it's so amazing.
Yeah, I feel like it just very straightforwardly takes a trans perspective and says, look at this. We'll take the medium of a YA superhero novel and we'll show you how much more complicated that is when you're not one of the people who's allowed to have that. I'm going to say nice things about Victories Greater Than Death, but I feel a little awkward saying it in front of you.
Oh my God. I could turn the camera off. I don't know.
No. Victories Greater Than Death, one of the things that I really liked was just watching. I've never really seen a novel that stages characters gradually realizing, like, I don't know, I've seen that gradual realization that you need a team play out many times, but the relationship between the kind of trans-coded cis lead and the trans femme that she falls in love with. Spoilers.
It's been out for a while. Screw it. I don't know.
That relationship, I feel like cis people could stand to learn some humility by encountering us.
Co-signed.
And yeah, that's one of the things I really love about that book. Just the process of this chosen one learning some humility and being like, okay, yeah, I'm a super powerful space princess, but what we really need right now is a trans girl hacker.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, Elsa's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. A Country Full of Ghosts is fascinating because it's I seldom read in 2022 like straight up political system fiction. And it's just a fascinating like exploration of, I don't know, it's the kind of perspective that you think to yourself, okay, only a trans femme would take this and just become like, preserve optimism in the face of absolutely terrifying exploration of the corruption of the crumbling empires that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. Now I really want to.
Oh.
I love Margaret Killjoy. I hadn't actually come across that one yet. So thanks for the recommendation. That's so cool.
Oh, absolutely. Little Fish is about alcohol abuse and failures of community and how much it sucks. But that's relatable. Like, who among us
I love
does not
Casey.
have... Summer Fun is absolutely fucking magical. Best way...
Who's Summer Fun by? Oh, Jean
Thornton.
Thornton. Okay, yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's
nice.
Amazing. Basically, Summer Fun, best way to describe it is a trans girl in the mid-aughts living in the middle of nowhere in the American Southwest starts doing a magical ritual to help her favorite 1960s reclusive, closeted trans woman musician finally come out, which takes the form of telling her story, which it's the 60s. It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely brutal, but at the same time, it's incredibly sweet. She also
Oh, that's
accidentally
awesome.
apocalyptic cis girl.
Wait, she also accidentally what?
Summons an apocalyptic cis girl.
Oh, I mean,
yeah, there's just this moment
collateral
where she's
damage. I don't know.
She's like, this cis girl arrived. I'm terrified of her. And it's just, it's fascinatingly staged. There's so much exploration of ambivalence and relationships across that class divide. Like impoverished trans girl, wealthy cis girl. Wealthy cis girl is absolutely certain that there's no power dynamic between them while using the power dynamic. I think that's really fascinating. Manhunt needs no introduction. It's making quite a splash. It's gorgeously splatterpunk and very sweet. Gifting Fire and Stealing Thunder are by my good friend Elena Boyden, and they explore what it means for a trans woman to be absolutely 100% a resourceful heroine who does whatever she needs to do.
Yay.
Detransition Baby is amazing to me because somehow Tori Peters managed to write the most incredibly biting satire about trans misogyny and make it a book club book.
No, it's amazing.
I think that's very cool. There's so many magical tricks. Like, I don't know. I think that's the defining
It's so well
feature.
done. It's such a incredible, like, just intense gut punch, and I love that book. Yeah, we're just so blessed to be living in a time with so many great trans books. It feels like, you know, we were living in a drought for so long, and now it's just like raining. And I'm like, yes, I just want to like soak myself in it all the time. It's so amazing.
Yeah, I think one of the defining features of trans feminine literature is strange and wonderful magic. The unexpected, the transformative, and the absolutely sneaky. Because we have to figure out, you know, the technique to sell the magical. We have to make the impossible possible, and this is a whole shelf of that.
Nice.
Oh my gosh.
Yay. All right, so I think we got time for maybe one more question. So I don't know. Okay, what does Apollo have to say about all this? Tessa asked. Actually, we got two choices of Tessa questions. Who is your favorite character to write, or what does Apollo have to say about all this? So pick one of those, or if you have time, answer both of them quickly. I don't know.
I have time for both because Apollo is a cat. Apollo is an absolutely beautiful cat. Apollo is probably in the room with Kristen. So shout out to Apollo, one of my favorite people in all the world. Apollo is an incredibly sweet cat who's also a god. So many times he's sat on my leg, cruelly digging his claws into my leg, and I've just looked down at him and thought, I am so lucky you're small, because if you were bigger, you'd kill me for fun. You'd expect me to appreciate how cool you were doing it. And then you'd probably be a little sad that I was gone forever. But fortunately, you're tiny. And I feel like maybe the gods would be so much less threatening if they were a lot smaller.
Yeah, probably true.
Maybe the gods got too big for their own good. Maybe small gods are what we need. My favorite character to write is an impossible question to answer. Thanks, Tessa. Patroclus made me cry the most.
I love Patroclus. He's so great.
He has so many things to say that are incredibly spot on, and sometimes he's unfair, and then he'll be like, actually, I was really unfair just now.
Oh.
Achilles was so bracing to write because she's 100% in her feelings. Whatever she's doing, she is fully committed to doing that. If she's having a hangover, she's having a hangover. If she's fighting, She's like, yeah, I love killing people. If she's crying over her friends, she's like totally into that. Nothing else is going on. Everyone else is like, well, there are other things happening in the world. And she's like, not for me. Great protagonist to write in that way because dramatic. The silent one. I have a lot of empathy for the silent one. That's Athena. Because, you know, she's an owl. Because on some level, as horrific as the powers of a god would make someone, there's this incredible loneliness and this yearning for connection with others that is simultaneously constantly frustrated by the whole being a god thing. And that gave me the most fascinating tension to explore. Like, she really does, almost despite herself, deeply care about Achilles. But she finds that incredibly confusing. And watching the confusion of a god is so interesting to write. Because they're not supposed to be confused by anything.
Well, cool. Okay, I think that's always how we have. Wrath Goddess Sing is such an incredible book. You should all buy it. You should all buy it from Mysterious Galaxy specifically. If you're watching the playback of this later, go back and buy that book. It's so amazing. It's such an amazing journey. It's such a cool, like, brutal, fascinating, you know, gut-wrenching book. I love it so much, and I can't wait for you all to discover it if you haven't read it yet. It's so awesome, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charlie Jane. This was incredible.
Aw.
And thank you for the kind things you've said about this book. I mean, yeah, it means so much to me.
Of course.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you so much, Charlie Jane. This has been such a wonderful and very intelligent conversation. I have probably heard about cultures, more about ancient cultures than I've heard in a while. So good job. And just like Charlie Jane was saying, you can get a Wrath Goddess Sings through Mysterious Galaxy. If you click the link below, that'll take you to our event page where you can buy the book. Not only that, but it also links to Charlie Jane's books on that same page where you can get her books if you haven't already, which you should definitely. Required reading. Required reading.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming out tonight, everyone.
Yay,
yes, thank you so much.
I
hope you all have a good night. We'll see you at the next
Drive
virtual
home
event.
safe.
Bye, everyone.